Hello, hello, hello. Welcome everyone. We will be starting in 2 minutes. So stay tuned. In 2 minutes, we start. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us from coast to coast to coast and beyond. I'm Abu Arif, son of a freedom fighter and a poet, husband of a very handsome man, and he wrote the script here. Uh, Brother of very annoying siblings, uncle of mischievous nephews and nieces, and and most importantly, self-claimed best friend of my best friend. I'm currently situated St. John's in the traditional territory of Mi'kmaq and Bithok. I want to start with acknowledging that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse indigenous groups. I respectfully honor the histories and cultures of Bithok, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. In addition, I graciously acknowledge the labor that the people of African descent unwittingly gave through transatlantic enslavement, the labor foundational to the building of the Canadian nation state and global economies, including shipbuilding and cod industries in Newfoundland and Labrador. Some of you know me, another may not. I'm a doctoral candidate and PhD fellow at the Faculty of Education at Memorial University, as well as an assistant editor of the Critical Internationalization Studies Network. As the curator of the Leadership Under Fire interview series, it is my honor to share this final session of this series with y'all. Yes, after several conversations with peers, mentors, and colleagues, I have decided to end this journey so that another journey can begin. I'm grateful to my colleagues at CISN, all moderators, panelists, and participants of this series for taking this journey. A journey through the rugged terrains of internationalization in higher education, critically examined leadership in IG. For the past 6 months, my heart, like many of yours, have been broken into pieces by one after the another global crises. From the heart-wrenching struggles in Palestine and Bangladesh to the turbulence in the North American political landscape and everywhere in between and beyond, some which have directly impacted my family, like many of yours. These moments have impelled me to shift my focus from illuminating the complexities of leadership in higher education, particularly in internationalization, to exploring how we might cultivate joy and self-care while living out our purpose amid forces intent on division and despair. In the words of Maya Angelou, we may encounter many defeats, but must not be defeated. The encountering may be the very experience which creates the vitality and power to endure. Her wisdom reminds us that resistant work need not be devoid of relational care or moments of joy. As a queer son, partner, brother, uncle, and a scholar, navigating these complex terrains, I affirm that our struggles are interwoven with the necessity of healing, creativity, and deep connection. Stay tuned for new series launching this summer where we will continue to explore how to live our truths and cultivate hope and joy even in times when we need to organize for profound resistance. Today, as we stand at the crossroads of critical internationalization studies, I invite you to join me in reimagining a future where equity and inclusion are not distant ideals but woven in our endeavor. In a moment, I will hand over the space to Rohin Bojaram, a dear friend and a colleague whose rich journey bridging Zimbabwean Canadian narratives with years of transformative leadership in internationalization and IBPOC initiatives will guide our conversation with my friend Punita Lam and my friend Dr. Amy McLean. Their dialogues promise to further challenge the status quo and inspire us to redefine leadership as a force for collective transformation. Without any further delay, floor is yours, Rohin.
Thank you so much, Ara, for that incredible opening and for grounding each and every one of us who are here today in collective and virtual space in both honesty and creativity and joy. And hopefully what we will imagine to bridge together is truth-telling. As Arif mentioned, many of us are here today with probably many questions on our minds and certainly a lot of heartache to process through. So it is an honor for me to be serving as your moderator, and even more of an honor to be sitting here in collective space with Dr. Punita Lam and Dr. Amy McLean. Before I invite Punita and Amy to share a little bit about themselves, I just want to create a bit of a backdrop that I know many of us know all too well. We are in a moment in time, a moment where there are continued aftershocks of the recovery of the pandemic, rising geopolitical tensions, complex renegotiation of funding, partnerships, and questions around how do we measure not just the efficiency, we love that word sometimes in higher education, but even more importantly, the effectiveness of internationalization. Every day, we are watching the ongoing shaky political landscape that we find ourselves not only here in Canada with the numerous immigration policies and shifts, but also when we look to the south, at least where I'm from, on the ancestral ancestral and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, otherwise known as Vancouver, British Columbia, we look at the United States and worry about the impacts of the massive layoffs, tariffs, and what I think many of us are watching as a live recent legal victory by Nadoe, in which the federal court issued a nationwide injunction that is preliminary on President Trump's anti-DEI executive orders. And there's so much more. That is the backdrop to which this conversation is going to be had. Now, I do have to say, we will not unearth every single complexity in our conversation today, but we will try, knowing that time is often needed to build and rebuild a new narrative and new actions. The structure of our time today is we'll spend about 45 minutes in which I will be asking questions that I know Punita and Amy will add not only thoughtfulness, but also incredible insight for each and every one of us to reflect on and act. I invite you as they share in the chat, drop comments, drop emojis, share what's resonating as they can feel that energy through what you write. There will then be time at the end for Q&A, and I'll let you know when that moment comes in order for you to share what is coming up for you and what you would like to ask. Without further ado, I would like to invite Punita and Amy to share a little bit about their journey. Starting off with you, Dr. Punita Lam.
Thank you so much. So before I get into a little bit about myself, I do want to share that I'm zooming in or teamsing in from the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Seneca, and the Huron-Wendat. Also, I'm not quite doctor yet. I actually am set to defend end of March. So almost there in a few weeks, but it's nice to hear. It's motivation, like, yeah, I'll be doctor soon. Fingers crossed. Um, but I really appreciate being here. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This is such an important conversation. Like Roheen and Arif set the context for this talk is during very troubling times, but I think it makes it even more important to talk about things like EDI and what it means for internationalization. I also really appreciated this question about sharing a little bit about our journey and who we are rather than the standard bio, because I don't know if the standard bio always tells us what we need to hear. And I had a little bit of an existential crisis around this question because now that I'm wrapping up my PhD, but I'm also a professional. I've been teaching for almost 10 years in the K-12 system in the field of social sciences. And so my work has always intersected with things like global citizenship and, diverse communities. And then I moved on to higher education, where I've done a number of roles as a coordinator, and now I'm a director in student life. And so what does that all mean as I'm bringing all these different experiences together, and what really motivates my work? And so I think, as I've been thinking about this, I've often reflected on how my own education experience has always been a very unhappy one. It's always been one where I've been contending with things like exclusion and racism. As a child growing up in the 80s, often being the only brown um, child in the classroom, there's been different things to endure, right? And I think one of the reasons I've stepped into education and I've wanted to always do a lot of critical work in education and think about how do we design spaces where not only do students feel like they belong, or staff or faculty or other teachers, but also create these spaces of deep criticality where we're questioning ourselves and how we perceive the world, and creating a space where people can come together and bring together all their different perceptions, and maybe we can imagine a new way forward, right? And so how do we create those really meaningful spaces of engagement and belonging? And I think that, if I was sort of to sum up my journey and who I am and what I do, that I think is the root of my work. Oh, I also want to add, I just have to say that I really appreciate the folks who are in internationalization right now. So if you're working in an internationalization office, much respect to you. I am a little bit sort of detached. So in my PhD, I get to critique internationalization from afar. In my practical work, I get to work with a wide student body, but I don't have to deal with the visa and immigration policy nightmares. And so hats off to folks who are reassuring students in the Canadian landscape with all the changes that are happening.
Thank you so much, Punita. And yes, I feel like we are just projecting something that we know is coming, which is your full official title of your doctorate. So a huge congratulations to you, and we're excited as you move into your defense. And thank you for sharing with us your journey. Amy, would love to hear from you. And I'm going to say Dr. Amy McLean would love to hear from you.
Heute, Amy McLean Renisquist, te na Pokoma, Statlium, Este Equin. Hi, everybody. It's really wonderful to be joining you today. My name is Amy, and I come from upstream, north of where the rivers meet in Statlium territories. And I'm so honored to be invited into these conversations today. I'm joining you from the unceded, stolen, and occupied territories of the Tecumseh Secwepemc within Secwepemc Ulu. And I'm really grateful to you, Punita, for the way that you spoke about your journey. And so I think I'm going to follow your lead in terms of those pieces. As a white settler, I trace sort of my ancestry, my background to white working class migrations of indentured servants, orphans and World War II resistance fighters. And I was first generation Canadian on my father's side and first generation scholar in my family. I grew up in a really deeply impoverished single parent family in rural British Columbia. And I grew up very much in deep connection with St'át'imc people, and in particular Lil'wat and Ikwakwa folks, who were really my first teachers about racism and white supremacy and privilege and colonialism. And I think because very much growing up in community and growing up in deep poverty, those experiences of going to school and being in community with folks and recognizing that while I may not be safe, I was a lot safer than some other folks and some of the people that I loved. And witnessing the kinds of violences of colonialism throughout my childhood and growing up, and then in that transition to post-secondary education, also becoming more and more exposed to the myths of white supremacy and colonial mythologies and so on. That finding the language through my academic studies to actually speak to the power dynamics I'd borne witness to throughout my life has been a really crucial and important part of my journey. So for that, for my master's degree, I was looking at post-secondary education, accountability frameworks and funding for Indigenous students. And then for my PhD, I went on to really be looking at the reproduction and rise of classist patriarchal white supremacy in local occupational cultures. And so, yeah, in my current work, I'm in a faculty position in intercultural learning. It's a position that I absolutely love. In the sense that I get to work pan-institutionally to support a lot of intercultural initiatives, research and teaching across the institution. And I also do want to really echo Panita's comments regarding folks who are working directly in internationalization and in international offices right now, because this is certainly a time where cultivating those solidarities and being there and showing up for students, it's all some pretty heavy lifting.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your introduction, and again, Panita, for sharing both for both of you, your journeys and what brought you here today in so much wisdom that I know is going to come over the time that we are in conversation. And I really appreciate the acknowledgement of how many of our colleagues across the institution and also globally who are not only supporting internationalization and supporting students who are either going abroad or coming to our institutions, they are in the thick of many of the conversations and the topics that I know will come up and emerge today. And so we send them not only solidarity, but also a lot of love and kindness, because I feel like that's definitely bountiful right now and needed. I always like us to start a conversation with really one that checks in with each and every one of us. So my first question is going to be one that I think people are going to be like, what is she asking? But I know that between Pranita and Amy, you'll know what I mean. The question that I have is, truly, at this moment in time, talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and accessibility and decolonization, and the nexus of that with internationalization, how honest can we really be in this conversation? Amy, can you start us off?
Yeah, I think it's such a crucial question. So thank you for bringing it forward. And a little bit, it feels like a dangerous one too. And I think that says a lot right there. You know, Rohini spoke so well to the pieces around the dismantling of EDI and DEI initiatives throughout the United States, but also we're seeing that mobilization and backlash within Canada and within academia. And that's a very real reality that folks are navigating. And I think, you know, we are also in a moment where sort of the the rise of neoliberalism has created these dynamics that make it even more difficult, where so many folks are working in precarious contract positions, and so on. They may be in administrative positions where the kinds of protections of academic freedom and so on and so forth are not there. And as we're seeing sort of this, the ascendance of right-wing authoritarianism fueled by misinformation, xenophobia, and hatred in the midst of a climate crisis, exacerbated by multiple global atrocities, and on we go. I think one thing I'm reflecting really heavily on too is the ways in which social justice, embedding equity, diversity, inclusion fundamentally in internationalization, that work has also been disproportionately placed on the shoulders of members of equity denied groups. And we're seeing now those folks are losing their jobs at the same moment that social programs in the United States, social programs like Medicaid are being slashed. And as the mother of a child who's medically extremely vulnerable, the depths of that threat and the reality of the mass violence that is occurring is really breathtaking. So there are these very real concerns. But in many ways, I also feel like that magnifies the responsibility of being that, it magnifies the responsibilities that being in this moment really kind of places on us. So I think we all have to navigate our own capacities for risk and safety, and the very real implications that can have, not just for ourselves, but for our communities and those who depend on us. But there also remains a moral imperative in speaking truth to power, which is not to say that we can't be relational and strategic, and probably have to be to some extent in the way that that's done. So yeah, I guess I would just I would probably finish by borrowing and adapting a phrase from Singh, and say that piece about leveraging our power and navigating our specific and intersectional vulnerabilities in service to social justice is a path that is narrow and slippery.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy, for the level of honesty, because I just looked it up. Thank you. Panita, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you, Amy, for sharing that. And as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about the word strategy. And so when I was thinking about this question, I asked myself at one point, do I lie? Like, can we be honest about these conversations? But are there moments when I have to lie about these conversations? And I sort of thought through all the different ways I navigate these conversations in the very different roles I have. My conversations and debates about EDI and internationalization are very different at academic conferences and in papers that I might be writing, versus when you're in the thick of things in an institutional role and you're trying to balance a number of different responsibilities, and you're trying to maintain different relationships with a variety of stakeholders as well who may not be on the same page with you about EDI. And so and I started to think a lot about, well, it's more about strategy and trying to figure out what needs to be said within this particular context. And I think, so I'll just share with you how I navigate things. I'm very much aware of the different types of structures that I may be operating in any given moment, and what would be appropriate for me to engage in within those moments. So it's, yes, I can be honest, but the conversations look very different depending on who, with whom I'm speaking. And so that does require a lot of strategizing, and it also requires a lot of thinking through discomfort. I was reflecting back on this one paper that a group of us wrote once we had analyzed internationalization strategies from universities across North America. And what we found was a real disconnect between internationalization strategies and EDIA strategies. And also within talking about EDIA, there was a complete silence when it came to topics like race. And so the paper that we have is called Diversity Without Race. And how do we actually talk about diversity without talking about the topics that make us feel really uncomfortable? And so, going back to what I was saying in my opening is, I find a lot of my work is about how do we create a space where it feels at least a little bit safe enough to get into uncomfortable conversations and start talking about the things that we really need to dig into to be able to move EDIA forward in internationalization. And, like I wasn't on any one of those strategic planning teams of all the documents that we analyzed. I can't even remember how many universities there were now. I want to say they were in the hundreds, but I was trying to imagine like what was happening during those planning meetings where their end product is so vague on EDIA and is so vague on race, and especially when we're thinking about race and how it's been impacting students from Asia during the pandemic. Like, how can we talk about internationalization and not talk about race? And so, what would it take to create enough comfort in those planning meetings to say, hey, we need to actually tackle something that's going to require a lot of self-reflection and maybe a realization that what we think we know is wrong, or we need to know more, or we need to question our own sort of bias and tropes that we've come to believe. What does it look like to create that space in an institution? And that's where I think a lot of the strategy comes in for me.
Wow. What would it take to create comfort? I think of that. I think of that question, Finita, that you just shared, and there's so many layers to it. Because I just think of what Amy offered us, which is sometimes embedded within this work is a lot of risk and a lot of danger. And so I think of, well, whose comfort gets prioritized? Whose comfort gets pushed aside for the greater good? And at what stage do we actually just talk about the thing, right? So I feel in many ways I'm getting to how do we start talking about the thing as part of our conversation today. In thinking about our time and our conversation, one thing that always strikes me as part of this broader definition of equity, diversity, and inclusion, or sometimes referred to as diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that there are so many different definitions and different starting points. And then when you connect that with internationalization, there again are different definitions and starting points. So I'd love to hear from both of you. What are your definitions? And then how are you actually seeing the version that you might want to offer here being enacted in higher education? I'll start off with Panita.
So they're both EDIA and internationalization are such big terms. and I don't think coming from an academic perspective, I don't think anyone actually agrees to, what exactly they are. There is no one definition, but one of the things I've seen with internationalization, at least in sort of my own research, is there's more of an institutionalization of internationalization. So there's more strategy being put behind it. There's more resources being put towards internationalization. People are coming up with metrics like quotas to fill. How many students do we want on global, mobility in global mobility programs? How many international students do we want to recruit? And so there's a lot of strategy, thought, and research being put behind internationalization in a way that I don't think it was always as intentional as it is today. And with my own research, I focus on actually interviewing faculty and how they navigate institutions and internationalization. And one of the things, that I've taken back from them is that the pressure to internationalize in a particular way, with the way the institution defines it, is heavy and is contradictory to what they actually want to do or need to do. And so that's been really I want to say interesting. That's been that's certainly been a finding where I think we need to really kind of stop and assess, like, how are we defining it, but then also how does it get enacted, right? And so we can come at it from different points of views, but the way it gets taken up is also just as messy. We have international student recruitment quotas to fulfill because we don't have enough money to operate. Like the government, like we're not funding universities well. And so now we have this model that's really unsustainable. And we're looking at these more neoliberal models and like how internationalization plays a role in that just to keep institutions afloat. And you know, now's a time where all of those conversations are coming up. But then there's also these other ways of defining internationalization, like it's a resource for diversity, or it's a way to create, you know, global communities, or it meets the expectations the university has around diversity and equity and inclusion. Um, and that takes on a very different look and feel than recruitment of international students for income, right? And they're contradictory. And so, but they're all existing at the same time, which I think is what makes these conversations so difficult. But EDI as well for me is the same. I oftentimes, if I've sat on equity committees, and there will always be people who leave it feeling upset because the committee didn't do what they thought it was going to do. And I think a large part of that is because we also have very different definitions and functions of EDI in an institution. And so if we think about equity as if we think about EDI work as risk management for the institution, it's about managing institutional reputation, then we have a lot of work that has to do with case management and dealing with complaints coming up. Versus if we're looking at EDIA as a way to, again, like that resource piece, diversity is a strength, it's a resource. And so we start looking at policies and work that's touching on things like quotas, maybe for faculty or faculty hiring or whatever that might be. And then there's other pieces around, you know, equity, diversity, and inclusion is a given. Like we want societies where we can all feel like we belong and that are diverse, and we've never been more globally connected than we are today. And therefore, there is no conversation about this without equity. Like there is no way for us to build community without these foundational values. And when we get into that value work, that's when we start seeing more of the, you know, the equity workshops that we invite everyone to attend and sort of rethink how they want to live in community and with each other. Lastly, I'll just touch on, you know, with all of these different ways of looking at EDIA, I think that's one of the things that's come up for me often in conversation with colleagues is this feeling of sometimes it never being enough. It's important. We need all the different EDIA initiatives, but we also need to acknowledge that EDIA operates within a specific structure of an institution that doesn't necessarily allow for more innovative ways of thinking about community and structure. And I often think about, I'm sure everyone's familiar with that imagery where people are playing a baseball game and there's a fence around the baseball game and there are people outside of it. And, you know, they talk about, well, the difference between equity and equity is giving each person outside of the fence a different size box to stand on or sit on for them to be able to see the game. And then when we talk about accessibility, you know, we can talk about, well, let's take away that fence. Why do we even have a fence? It's just in the way. It's reducing accessibility. And I think when we talk about terms like decoloniality, it's more around, what if I don't even want to play that game? Now what will it look like, right? And I think that gets really scary because EDIA kind of operates within a fixed structure. And as soon as you're like, well, actually, I want to not be in this structure, or like I want to shift the structure or imagine a new structure, we start to hit a lot of, I think there's a lot of people who desire it, but then we start to hit all the problems of like, well, how? Or there's a lot of fear and what it might look like to take down that structure. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, I love that so much, Punita. And I think the imagery that you gave us also, I think for me is picking up on what if the box, right? The box that has framed the entire systems, what if the box just didn't even exist? And I think for many of us, even asking that question feels so phenomenally scary because we've all been conditioned to know that there's a box, right? There's a box and there's parts of the box that you can, perhaps maybe break apart, etc. But to go to the place where you could truly recreate a different reality and a different way of being, for some, that's too far-fetched and far of a stretch. And I can see how then the layers of definitions become perhaps rooted in how comfortable people are to go closer to this idea. Amy, I know you've been sitting there with lots of thoughts, so I'm gonna give you the floor. So please, we would all love to hear what you'd like to share.
I again want to echo your gratitude for Panita's answer, and I have like on the side here, I taken a little bit of notes, and I have messy like written in big large letters because I'm like, it's messy. Yeah, I mean, I think on one hand, that importance of having shared understanding, shared language, shared meaning when it comes to these terms and how they're defined and enacted is so important, but it is messy. There are so many different, we can't even agree on an acronym, right? So it is really, really messy. And so I think I would speak, yeah, I think in that context of the structure, right? And the ways in which there is this structure to EDI, and often also internationalization. It will be placed within a particular structure within the institution. But speaking to the specific one regarding EDI, I think that what we've witnessed in the sort of quick uptake of EDI, and now that's the language that is now being used, is to me sort of the hallmark of neoliberal and neocolonial governance that we have seen with social justice movements over and over again, where there is this quick institutionalization that really has the potential to lose radical potentials, right? Because if it's institutionalized, if it's placed, off in one office, often an office that is housed within human resources or within an administrative unit, there's a vulnerability to that, right? It makes it incredibly easy to simply erase when there aren't those kinds of protections, when it isn't something that isn't, put off over here, but is actually fundamentally interwoven into the fabric of the university, into the fabric of everything that we're doing. And then I guess when I worry about EDI, and the other thing that I would sort of bring forward, Panita, you were talking about those people leaving upset and feeling like it didn't do what it was supposed to do. And I'll often get the question of like, how do we bring in the folks who don't show up and the people who aren't taking it? My actual deeper fear is a little bit different. And it's the question of those folks who do show up and those folks who learn to become more sophisticated in their oppression through current enactments of EDI. And so I'm thinking in particular, for example, folks who may be extraordinarily adept at speaking the language of anti-racism while weaponizing white supremacy to devastating effect. Right. So that's another concern I'll just raise when it comes to those enactments. And I think particularly, and maybe this is a concern that has to wait for us to navigate the immediate crisis in front of us. But I think that there are ways in which systems of oppression survive even when they're unpopular, or even when it's not okay to be, openly racist through those avenues. And I think, similar critiques could be, and have been made, and Panita, I think, perfectly spoke to those pieces of the ways in which internationalization can also be seen as, capitalist neocolonialism and the large scale sort of the reproduction of power dynamics involving the exploitation by dominant nations as mechanisms to further entrench settler and colonialism, right? Particularly if we're not wrestling really deeply and with an eye to accountability for what it means to connect the internationalization of higher education to national immigration strategies on stolen lands. What does that actually mean to be doing that? And of course, we're living in the moment where the risks and consequences of neoliberal market-based approaches to internationalization and how the risks of the harms that come with it are borne in vastly unequal ways could not be more apparent than they are now. But then I want to return to hope because it feels really important to cultivate that piece. And I will say that I think when it comes to hope, and you know, that envisioning piece, I like to envision internationalization as cultivating those relational spaces for engagements to foster reciprocal learning and unlearning in service to social justice. And likewise for EDI to be a relational space for folks who are connected to ongoing histories of anti-oppressive resistance, as like an inclusive umbrella term for all those folks who are working to advance social justice in all its forms and vectors, and to do so in right relations with each other. So I hope that through this moment that we are all trying to navigate through, there will also be space for reflection and consideration of more intentional, reciprocal, and I would also say probably evidence-based approaches, right?
Absolutely. I'm so thankful to both of you because you both embody um, the dissonance that we're all feeling, right? That deep pressure from within of being in the messiness and the tension of this work, wanting to do good work, wanting to serve in a way that connects with people's lived experiences, lived realities, challenges, vulnerabilities, historical and persistent violence, and also wanting to create capacity for both within and in our work for hope and for joy and for the so-called, light at the end of what feels like a very long tunnel that's never ending. And so I really appreciate that. And I know that others who are both listening and watching are seeing that, because that is the work, the bubbling of the depth of the dissonance and the request for each and every one of us to surface how do we live in the both and versus the always the requirement for a binary way of being. I know that there are many people in the audience who are in a variety of roles and also perspectives and connections to both equity, diversity, and inclusion and internationalization. And some are researchers, some are students, some are faculty, some are leaders. And so I draw on my next question being, in your experience and your journey of integrating EDI, DEI, EDIA, decolonization, and internationalization in your practices, where do you draw your sources of theory, the evidence base, Amy, that you mentioned, the body of literature, to give you strength to do this work well? Panita, would you like to start us off? And then Amy, if you want to just follow through, I won't insert myself in the middle.
Sure. So in the midst of doing my PhD, I'm sort of drowning in papers and different different theories, but there's a lot of fascinating decolonial work that's been done globally. And, whether you're looking at scholars from Latin America or parts of Africa or the South Asia, there's just so much richness in what's been written. And, even when I came across things written from the 1800s to early 1900s, just reading about the resistors and the people who dared to imagine a very different world, it's been so incredibly inspiring for me. And so that's where I'll draw a lot of my thoughts from, because, you know, reading that gives me an opportunity to then, gives me the freedom and the space I need to also reimagine things. But in terms of, is it okay if I share a strategy, or do you want to just do sharing? Yeah. I wanted to, I think a really good example of a strategy. So one of the strategies I use is partnering with students. It's really important to me that to get at the complexity and the nuance of issues, that we need to do it in partnership and in community. And so there was a particular partnership that was done with leaders. Some were leaders, some were leaders in their own sense within their communities, the diverse Muslim community on campus. And this was a mix of international students, domestic students, newcomer students. I mean, these labels are all, they're all sort of constructed anyway. But and so, you know, when we were working on what would it look like to create a student-led series of workshops or town halls on Islamophobia and how Islamophobia is experienced on campus, those planning meetings were actually riddled with conflict. And I think this also speaks to some of the issues we run into when we're trying to do internationalization or trying to do EDIA, is that we sometimes overlook the nuances and the complexities of our identities and our experiences. And so, you know, what I ended up having was a group of students who had very different experiences around Islamophobia and race. And depending on where they had grown up, it was a very different understanding of their identity. And so we couldn't come into agreement of what one workshop or one program might look like to address something as complicated as, you know, a form of discrimination. In this case, it was Islamophobia. And, you know, we ended up doing, I ended up supporting them, I should say, with a series of town halls where they collected a lot of information. And we ended up publishing that into a small institutional report that students then presented at caucus, which was so great to see them do work like that. But, you know, what happened sort of a year after that project, there was the Islamophobic attack in London, Ontario, where a family was killed, or members of a family were killed in an Islamophobic attack. And, you know, one of the members of that group wrote a reflection piece on not only the attack, but also her experience in working in that project. And, you know, there was this really deep sort of, it was good critique. It was, you know, we can't always get it right when we're doing this work. And I think there's a lot of fear around that as well, is like, what if I do this work and it's wrong? But I don't think there's a blueprint for perfect work. But I think when we're in community and we're working together in community, we can have really difficult conversations with each other. And that's what these students were doing, and their reflections after the fact, and in, you know, connecting it to very real experiences in the world that are so violent. And how do we go about addressing and defining Islamophobia? And so, you know, that to me was just an example of this like richness and deepness and complexity that we often we overlook it when we're trying to design programming that can speak to, even though we know it, I think a lot of the times we fall into the trap of monolithic stories of the experiences of particular, you know, communities. And then that's what we try to address, but then it misses a whole population. And that was also a reason why a lot of these students wouldn't turn up to some of the workshops that were already being offered at the university, because they weren't seeing their narratives represented in any meaningful way. And so that's a strategy where I always learn a lot from as well.
Thank you so much for your answer. Again, I have all these scribbled pieces, and I think there's so much in what you've said. That piece about, you know, partnering with students and really working in profoundly relational ways is something that I would absolutely echo, as well as those pieces around nuances and complexity. And for me, I think that has always meant that there's a real intense need to be very contextually specific in what we're doing and how we're doing it, in strategies and initiatives and so on. That becomes absolutely crucial. And also, I think that piece about that fear of getting it wrong, I think when there's a recognition of just how important the work is and just how harmful the harm can be, then that can also be, that fear of getting it wrong or the overwhelm can lead to not doing anything. And I think moving past that is something that becomes incredibly important. And it's funny, when I was reflecting on this question, I found myself having an unexpected answer, which in terms of like what helps ground you in terms of like the literatures and so on that you draw on in these strategies. And I found myself really thinking about the ways that I draw really deeply on my training in qualitative and ethnographic methods. And so in particular, coming around those pieces around critically reflexive and contextual praxis, and how do we actually be, not just continually reflect on actions, role, impact, and the way that we're impacted by our social location, but also the ways that others interact with us differently as a result, and being accountable for that. Yeah, very much the training in qualitative and ethnographic methods that's speaking to the power of story, narrative analysis, and those decolonial approaches, but also that requirement for constant critical reflection on all the complex ways that we're implicated in social dynamics, hierarchies, and exercises of power. And I know, like, I'll be forever grateful to the mentorship of Dr. Derek Culhane in those practices. And then the other thing I wanted to pick up on was your talk about monolithic stories. And because I think for myself as well, that creating opportunities for dialogic storytelling in service to social justice is definitely, that would be another strategy, right? So creating intentional and safe as possible opportunities for bridging across sociocultural differences to create opportunities for learning and unlearning. But I also want to emphasize that in that work, that the really grave importance of thinking very complex in complex ways, what work stories do and the power that stories have, right? So I've had the really, immense privilege of being exposed to a wide range of bodies of thought and so on in my various journeys. And actually, this can sort of seem sort of strange in terms of my path not being straightforward in terms of both my academic journey and so on. So my PhD dissertation, one of the focus of it was the reproduction and rise of white supremacy, patriarchal white supremacy in long haul trucking. And one of the pieces that I analyzed in that was this really racist and racializing story that allowed racism to become coded in the language of culture that was weaponized by white truckers in particular against South Asian students. And in a previous role, it was my first few days in a job in a previous role at a post-secondary institution, and I'd only been there, I think, 24 hours before an administrator, a white administrator, told me a slightly changed version of the same story about South Asian international students as was occurring in those other places. So the power of the stories that are in community and the way that they are also infiltrated throughout our institutions and doing that myth-busting work. Also, there's a critical imperative of actually confronting those kinds of incredibly oppressive narratives and mythologies.
I know I had to certainly take a deep breath of just so much gratitude, but also a deep breath because both of you have just taken us probably 3 more layers deeper into how not only complex, but how how much of this work is sitting with those who are survivors of oppression, and also those who are unconsciously and consciously in a position of oppressing. And I can't help but think for many of us, the context is we're working in higher education. Many of us are in that place of scholar practitioner. And I can appreciate for some people who are here, who are graduate students, thinking about their positionality, thinking about their research methodology. That hyphen of scholar practitioner is what you're also both speaking to, is bridging some of the theories and some of the scholarship and the evidence that hierarchically has not been seen as credible. I think of the lived experiences, the storytelling, and how we bridge that with the practical elements of the policies, the practices, the people, to create a better experience, to create better treatment. And so I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Panita. Thank you, Amy, for delving deep and also delving within, because I know you've both shared such powerful experiences that I know are also indicative of your own experiences. With that, we are close to our time. We just have about 15 minutes, and I would love to give some of that time in that portion to those who are here in collective space who would like to ask questions. So I would invite anyone who is here with us, if you have a question, please do offer it by typing it in the chat. Or alternatively, if you would like to ask your question by verbalizing it, I will admit Teams is not my go-to platform, so I don't know if there's like a raise hand feature, but if there is, if you want to raise your hand, and then we could invite you in and to unmute and ask your question as well. So there's multiple ways in which we'd love to connect in with you. And if there is no raise hand feature, then please feel free. If you do have a question, you could also just simply unmute yourself as well. And just to let you know, we're all comfortable with silence. At least I know I am. So we could give everybody a chance to really think about what that question might be that's on their hearts and on their minds. And if not, I do have a couple more questions, so that's also open. Arif, please go ahead.
I'm sorry for like breaking the silence and asking this question. I really wanted to. Thank you so much for this powerful conversation. I just have I think it's a simple question, but also could be complex. And I asked this question because this is all I'm thinking these days. Is it how do we balance between feeling guilt and cultivating joy at a time of such crises? I mean, as you are leading projects, working through and living through this moment, how one deal with the guilt of cultivating joy?
Thank you, Arif. I think that's a question that is so important to for you to have surfaced for us, because it probably is a question that many of us are waking up every day thinking about, do I go to work or don't I? And then layered with that. Amy and Punita, would anyone would love to respond?
I don't know if I have an answer, but I totally hear what you're saying, Arif. I think there are days when I think about, oh, I actually have so much privilege that I can turn off, where I don't have to deal with a particular topic because I have the privilege and the safety to not have to, engage with it. But um, I think the other piece is that the joy piece and um, being healthy is such an important part of resistance, and that we can't ignore it. Like, we do need to be able to find moments of joy, or, like, I don't know what else to call it, like there needs to be healthy spaces where we're not just, in all the negativity and anger, because that's not a healthy space to be in all the time either. And I think for me, um I came across this term once, tragic optimism, and I loved it, and it really resonated. It's from Viktor Frankl originally, from his work, like, where basically, as a Holocaust survivor, was finding meaning in such dire, terrible conditions, that how do you make meaning, and how do you continue to find joy? And I found it such a powerful read. And I've thought often about that term, tragic optimism, and what it must mean for people in different parts, and who are dealing with different things in their lives. And yeah, so not really an answer as much as it is still really important, though, to find spaces to look for joy and keep ourselves healthy.
I'm reflecting on the question and just where I should or can go. And I'm worried that what I'm about to say is too much. But I'll say with complete honesty, I don't feel guilt for cultivating joy. In fact, I feel like it is so desperately important. Like, this is that joy is what we're fighting for, right? And as those pieces of imagining, we can't just imagine futures, but if we have within our own sphere of influence the opportunity to create, if not the world's moments or pieces of what we envision, for joy and so on, we have to do it. It's absolutely crucial. And I have the honor of walking alongside other parents who spend a lot of time in pediatric oncology wards. And if you watch the ways in which folks come together to cultivate joy in incredibly difficult spaces, then for me, that will always ground that work of cultivating joy, and also our intergenerational responsibilities to do so.
Yeah, so much of what Punita and Amy have shared, and Arif, I know you and I have had multiple conversations about this. And I'd love to also offer a response. I had a great great grandmother who in Zimbabwe was part of an incredible African tradition in which she was going to be, as the eldest daughter, the next chief. And in African culture, at least in where I was based in Zimbabwe, that was very much a part of the way in which the village worked, right? There was no such thing as gender. There was no such thing as a woman couldn't take her place. And yet, at that moment in time, that is when the British came and colonized. And so there was a lot of infiltration about specific customs and hierarchy. And essentially, the oral tradition, because this is an oral story that has been passed through my generations, was such that she was denied her right to take her place as being the eldest daughter until one of her uncles stepped in and said, this is not how we do things. And so the chief at the time, her father, made a choice to then bridge And that was probably the first mistake. But, we honor what decisions had to be made at the time and bridge two ways of being by essentially giving my great-great-grandmother her birthright, but then asking her to marry one of the soldiers. And that was the start of a whole slew of things for my entire family. I bring that up as a story because for many of, at least myself, and I think many of us who come from different cultures where oral storytelling and the violence and the ruptures and the moral injury and the cruel optimism and the ethical spaces that we find ourselves, they're continuously being ruptured and violently torn apart. And so hope can be challenging to maintain. But here's what I remember in telling all of you that story, is that at no point in time did my great-great-grandmother say, I'm going to give up. What she always often said, and this is the message that gets passed down, is, I'll wait. I'll wait. So I think for all of us, as we're doing this work, I think there is also time for us to think about, a time for us to stretch time and to also find ways in which we're caring for ourselves and telling ourselves, I'll wait. Maybe that change, or maybe the decision, or maybe the thing that we're waiting for might not come today, but it does not mean it won't come tomorrow or the next day. And to give ourselves that grace and that time to also heal, rather than having to feel the pressure to be resilient and bounce back into professional me. So I offer that as well. Thank you, Ara, for starting us off. Just wanted to say thank you. There's so many comments in the chat, a lot of people sharing just words of gratitude and words of resonance. Many are here in Canada for a few months. So thank you so much, Victoria, for sharing with us that this is giving you a lot of context in terms of you also thinking about your time here and also coming from South America. I see also Grace sharing that a lot is sinking in about what does it look like to think and also work and do this incredible work alongside a variety of groups of students, and specifically racially and minoritized students as well. So again, thank you to everybody for your time here. Thank you for being here in collective space. And I will end us off with asking Amy and Punita, before I do a closing piece, if you could leave us with one word that could describe walking this world and this work in a good way, what would that word be? One word of walking this world and this work in a good way, what would that be? And whoever feels called to unmute, please go ahead.
I don't know if Amy has a word yet. I'm like, are you gonna hit the unmute button? I think I'm gonna say unfinished. That probably needs a little bit of explanation. I think it gives me a lot of hope to constantly add and or but to the end of a sentence or to the end of a situation. It's not the end, like, even though sometimes it feels really dark, it's nothing is sort of finished. And so unfinished, I think, is going to be my word.
I think I'm going to go with connectedness. I almost went with messy, but I'm going to go with connected, because I think that piece about being in relation with folks who are fiercely doing this work, it is incredibly important, and it also is also creates those opportunities to be called in when we need to do the unlearning we need to do and to show up in good ways.
Thank you. Thank you, Panita. Thank you, Amy, so much for being here in what feels like a balm to our souls. And I see Kyra in the chat has also certainly echoed that in terms of a tonic and a thoughtful conversation. I also want to say thank you so much to Arif and to Santiago for being here and for curating the container. I think so much of these spaces are not possible without leadership and without individuals who want to create a meaningful space where very hard but also important conversations are necessary. And for all of you who heard Arif at the beginning sharing with us that leadership under fire is ending in this way and beginning in a different way. We certainly send RFU and Santiago so much love and so much support as you think about where you might take the next step. As we end our time together, I just want to end with a quick reminder, and that is drawing from an incredible scholar and certainly author, and that's Bell Hooks. I wrote an article in University Affairs about this important statement, and that was that bridges get walked on. I invite you, I'll put the link in our chat to read it. But here's the underlying message that I think is very timely as we close our time together. The reality is that we walk upon bridges built by those who bore the weight before us. Their strengths are often tested by silence, by noise, by progress, and by things that are seen and also unseen. Many of you heard from Punita and Amy some really not only harsh but important truths. And so I think many of us stand and sit and probably also curl in the fetal position in liminal space of known pasts and also sometimes intangible futures. So I urge us to remember that as part of our bridges and our passages, that they're actually strong enough to bear if we collectively work together towards justice. I know many people are saying, and I will be remiss to say I'm not one of them, that EDI or DEI is dying. The reality is the journey actually is continuing. Now is not the time to sit in silence, nor is it the time to sit in isolation, but rather together. It will require each of us to walk towards each other across the bridge, even when we have differences of opinion. It is in that walking that we will activate the hope, because hope will be the active force that bends the arc of higher education towards a better reality and perhaps towards inclusion. Thank you for spending your time with us today. May you go today with ease and with hopefully one thing that you can take away to add to your day. Thank you for being here with us. It is an honor to have shared this space. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.